there's a lot of talk at the moment about what the ultimate objective should be, and there are people still cautioning against a Russian defeat and saying that actually ultimately we're going to have to negotiate. What do you make of that, and what's your take on that?
Well, so of course we're going to have to negotiate one way or the other. The war will end with a negotiation, but I think it's important to understand that if you want the war to end forever, in other words, you don't want it to end for 6 months and then continue, or even 3 years and then continue. If you want there to be an end to Russian imperialism in the modern world, if you want Ukraine to survive as a state, if you want Russia's neighbors to remain normal, stable countries, then yes, there has to be a Russian defeat, and it has to come in the form of a Russian realization that this invasion was a mistake, and that the empire is finished. And that could take different forms depending on what happens inside Russian politics, depending on what happens on the ground. I'm not offering a formula or saying the border has to be here or there, but there has to be a moment when the Russians understand the war was a mistake, it was an error. We're going to withdraw our troops, I would say, at the very least, back to the borders of February of last year. Maybe back to the borders of 2014, if that's what it takes. But there has to be a moment when they conclude this is not the way forward for our country. We're destroying our country. We're wrecking its prospects. We're wrecking its economy. We're wrecking our relationships with the rest of the world. And if you want to call that a defeat, yes, that's a kind of defeat, and that needs to happen. Or we could be in the position where there's some kind of ceasefire or some kind of temporary agreement, and then the war begins again in a few years' time.
Do you have any sympathy with those European statesmen, those European commentators who are reluctant to send heavy weaponry and particularly tanks to Ukraine because of the implications that might have?
I'm really not sympathetic at all, because at this point we know that most of what the kinds of threats that the Russians make about what they will or won't do, most of that is bluff. Most of it is their way of deterring us. We are now at the phase of the war where the Ukrainians need to take back territory. In other words, they need to go on the offensive. And it's pretty clear that one of the tools that you need to go on the offensive is modern tanks, maybe longer range weapons as well. I just don't see that there any moral or political difference between tanks and artillery. I mean, why would you give one and not the other? Why pretend there's some huge distinction between them? I mean, I don't think that these are different categories of weapons. I know that people have in the back of their heads this idea of, we can't escalate. But the problem is that the Russians are escalating all the time. They keep carrying out more atrocities. They run torture centers and detention centers and concentration camps on the territory of occupied Ukraine. We know about all that too. And so they're fine with escalating. So I think it's time for us to understand that we need to, what we're doing is not provocative. What we're doing is a legitimate response.